Oh, the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. This is a story that is so easy to think of as just a fairy tale, or to dismiss it as somehow being at odds with evolution and the Big Bang. Try to read it scientifically. Or it's easy to dismiss because it has led to that doctrine called original sin, making so many people who especially grew up in more conservative forms of Christianity feel a lot of shame and a lot of feelings of unworth. It's so easy to want to walk away from it or dismiss it. But it is so much more than any of these things. It is a creation myth, this story of Adam and Eve. Creation myths are not meant to answer scientific questions, but meant to answer existential questions, cultural questions, spiritual questions. In other words, the meaning of life. There's a famous theologian named John Dominic Crossan who famously said once, "My point is not that ancient people wrote literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically. My point is that ancient people wrote symbolic stories and we are dumb enough to try to take them literally." I do think that is a very helpful lens for thinking about Genesis. What you may not know, maybe some of you do, is that in Genesis there are actually two different creation myths. There are two different stories for how God created the world. One's in Genesis 1, the other's in Genesis 2 to 3. In the first one, men and women are created together. There's no story of Adam and Eve at all. In the second one, there is, of course, Adam, and then Adam has brought all the animals of the world and asked which one he has to name them and who he would like as a companion, and he's very unhappy with all of them, and so that leads to the creation of woman, Eve, out of Adam's rib. And you can see just in that little detail, and there are many, many more differences, what different cultural messages come from these two different creation myths in Genesis, right? And of course, there were other creation myths surrounding the ancient Hebrew people. One that is probably best known, although probably not so well known that you've actually heard of it, is called the Enuma Elish. It was the Babylonian creation myth. You may remember that the Babylonians, for the ancient Hebrew people, were an empire. They were an oppressive force. They were someone to be at war with. And in this Babylonian myth, everything in the cosmos comes from violence. The cosmos itself is made of the body of a goddess who was killed in a power struggle. Humans are created from the blood of a traitor god, and they are created specifically to perform labor and maintain the divine order, allowing the gods to rest. So in the Babylonian creation myth, humans are functionally slaves. And so the relationship between humans and the divine is more one of master and slave. I think that's important context for the creation myth of Genesis, because it shows how radical and revolutionary it was. In the Genesis creation myth, humans are made in the image of the divine. And they are made not to do work for God, not to take on tasks that God doesn't want to do, but created simply because it gave God joy to create them. And far from a master-servant relationship, we have this image of God walking in the garden with the humans. The humans have dignity and selfhood. They have the choice to do things that God tells them they shouldn't do. And God seems to want to be in relationship with them, even to be friends with them. How different than a master-slave relationship. How different than a creation myth that sources the meaning of creation in violence. Now, if what you grew up hearing the most about the Genesis narrative was about Eve and the serpent and the apple, and that's how sin got into our world, side note, there is no apple in the scripture. It just says fruit. Well, if that's what you grew up hearing, and then you heard that God banished them from the garden because they disobeyed, and they were banished from the garden because of that was their punishment. That is probably what most of us heard. And I want to say that it kind of shows how much we humans, despite the difference of the Genesis myth to other myths, how much we are still drawn to interpretations of myths that emphasize violence and degradation of humans. Because while that is a part, that is one interpretation of the myth, it is also, I think, a tragic misreading and reduction of the Genesis story. Because any reading of Genesis has to begin with God creating and seeing that it was good, including humans. That is the starting place for any interpretation. Now, I say that knowing that our very lectionary, we only get a very small part of the story today, right? And it does seem to want us to affirm the more narrow reading of Genesis. The story of Adam and Eve and the serpent, as if that is the only important part of the story. Now, maybe you can tell from how I'm talking about this, I did used to teach this story to undergraduate students. And I'd have them go through the text as I was teaching them, and I'd have them find questions to ask as they were reading it. Because there are a lot of questions that come up as we read it. And just in the portion that we read for today, I don't know, maybe you have some questions. Now, when I've done this before at Epiphany, this has gone over like a lead balloon. But I want to try it again. Anyone have any questions? Like when you read the Genesis story today, did anything make you scratch your head and say, does that even make sense? I'll give you a minute. How about you, Eric? You're a literary guy.
If it was supposed to be Eden, why was there one tree you couldn't eat from?
Thank you.
Why isn't it all just all good?
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Why didn't Adam stop her? What's so convincing about a snake? Tom?
What is the meaning of the Latin word malus, which is the genus of apple?
Interesting. I think you know the answer to that question. I don't think that was an actual question. Oh, okay. Yeah?
I've always wondered why our Heavenly Father would want to keep us from knowledge.
Yes.
That it just doesn't make sense.
Thank you. That's a great question. So many questions, right? I remember one of my students saying, because there's this part later on where God gets mad at the serpent and says, from now on, you're going to be on the ground on your belly. And my student was like, so what was it doing before? If it was a snake, was it just flying through the air? And that image has stuck with me ever since, this levitating snake, So yes, lots of questions. What spiritual insights might we take from this excerpt of this ancient creation myth? Well, I'm going to just touch on a hair, just a little bit of some of the richness of this story. And first, something that always caught my attention is this tree, for multiple reasons. Eve calls it simply tree in the middle of the garden. And the serpent tells her that when she eats from it, she will become like God, knowing good and evil. Now, what the serpent does here, I think, is very interesting. It's as though he is suggesting to her that she should want something that she did not originally seem to want. Was she concerned with being like God before this? But when the serpent poses this to her, it introduces a new way of thinking about God, whose original intent seemed to be one of relationship, of mutual giving and receiving with the humans, and the receiving of joy. But when the serpent introduces this desire to Eve, God becomes a potential rival rather than the source of being. It makes me think about all the ways we are taught to desire different things in the world. Children generally are not born wanting to dominate others. Children are generally not even born particularly violent. Children are not born wanting to have all of the latest gadgets. We are very, very susceptible in terms of our desire, right? Just think about advertising. All the things that you start desiring if you watch a good 8 hours of television. Now, some Jewish mystics call this tree the tree of doubt instead of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And there's a good reason for that. The Hebrew word here that is translated as knowledge, it's the first time this word is used in the Bible. And that word happens its second time in the narrative when it is used to describe Adam knowing his wife, leading to the first pregnancy. So it has undertones of intertwining of good and evil, making them indistinguishable from one another and difficult to discern, leading to doubt. And of course, right after they eat from this tree, Adam and Eve hide from God, as though they no longer trust that they really know who God is. Perhaps God is a rival. Perhaps in their nakedness, they should be ashamed. The tree of doubt. But just as much as it is the tree of doubt, I also think of it as the tree of false certainty of good and evil. Because, of course, human history is rife with stories of one people group deciding that another people group is evil, either by the virtue of their birth or their religion, or even the fact that maybe they are doing evil things and harming people, but we often decide another group is evil on that basis without being willing to look at the ways good and evil intermix in our own lives, right? And so I think one of the biggest takeaways here is that the desire that the serpent awakens in Eve, the desire to be like God, that desire will cause us more harm than any them out there, any other people group that we think is dangerous. Our desire to be like God will be much more harmful than those people. Our desire to be invulnerable, to not need anyone else, to never be wrong, to handle things on our own, to decide that there are some people we can simply do without, that desire is the source of evil and harm in the Genesis myth. And we see in this story the immediate result of eating from the tree, the immediate result of the world becoming divided into good and evil and intermixing in confusing ways. The immediate result is shame and blame. They hide from one another, they hide from God. Adam blames Eve, Eve blames the serpent. The effect of eating of this tree, of the intermingling of good and evil, is to say, it wasn't me, and don't look at me. Which, of course, we see the effects of this all over the world today. In everything from bumper stickers that say, don't blame me, I voted for XYZ, to the movement afoot now to change the way history is taught as to deny the impacts of the ideology of white supremacy on the birth of this nation, to multinational corporations who refuse to take ownership for the ways their practices have harmed the planet, and of course, by extension, vulnerable people. It wasn't me, don't look at me. And yet, in Christianity itself, we also have a history of misunderstanding this. We have a history of telling abused people that the actions of another were somehow their fault, of throwing up our hands and saying, well, Christian nationalism isn't my fault, or, well, my church doesn't discriminate against gay people, so not my problem, without examining the ways that our interpretations and teachings might actually be rooted in similar things. We often respond to this intertwining of good and evil, just like Adam and Eve, with self-righteousness, as a way to avoid the difficult feelings of doubt and uncertainty. And you know, all the ways that various metaphorical serpents, flying or on the ground, come into our lives, teaching us that relationships mean always winning or always losing, or that we must harden ourselves against others or diminish ourselves to be worthy of love, or that we were made for shame and hiding. All of these serpents are still out and about. Let me be clear, metaphorical serpents, because I actually think snakes are pretty cool. But they are out there. They're in our lives. They have been taught to us. They have been our teachers. They have been our teachers. But I want you to remember this week, in this first Sunday of Lent, the season that gets a really bad rap for being a season of suffering. You were made for goodness. Everything is rooted in God created the world and saw that it was good. You were made for relationship with God that is not master and slave, but is friend. And that means we were made for relationships with one another that are not power over and power under, but power with. And that's the image that is meant to guide all of our relationships, including with ourselves, with the earth. We were not made for hiding. We were not made for shame or fear of God. And our example for all of this, of course, is Jesus, whose message seems to boil down to one thing, right? Love. This creation was made from love. And friends, you and I, all of us here, everyone out there, we were made for love. Amen.